In 2019, Aston Hall was voted the UK's most haunted heritage site by Spectrum Paranormal Investigations and the National Lottery. With the spirit of a young lady who died of heartbreak, a servant boy who hanged himself, and a green lady who is also said to haunt the upper floors, Aston Hall has been the subject of many paranormal investigations. This morning, I decided to make the short journey into Aston to take a look for myself. Is Aston Hall really haunted? Join me as I head inside to find out. This is the haunting of Aston Hall. The first thought when arriving at Aston Hall is just how out of place this huge old mansion feels. Surrounded by the hustle and bustle of Aston itself, and Villa Park, the home of Aston Villa Football Club, on its doorstep, this doesn't strike me as an area where you'd find a glorious 1600s Jacobean mansion. If, like me, you have no idea what a Jacobean mansion is, Jacobean is relating to the reign of King James I. Yet, as you turn in through the gates, there it is, the imposing Aston Hall. As usual, I arrived early to get a feel for the place, took some video footage and photographs, really taking some time to absorb the atmosphere. From the outside, honestly, the building just looks incredible, but nothing prepares you for what's on the inside. It's just a maze of room after room of glorious architecture. You can almost feel the history as if it's been soaked into the very fabric of each room. The oak beams and floors, the walls, the ceilings, the paintings and the furniture. Every inch of this historic building feels like it has its own story to tell. As I entered the building, I was greeted by a few members of staff, one of whom gave me a pretty in-depth rundown of the history of the place, from when and why it was built, who lived here, and some of the significant historical events that unfolded here. And I'd just like to say, the staff members were incredible. They couldn't do enough to make me feel welcome. They're all obviously very enthusiastic about the place. They all know their facts, and they're more than happy to share their knowledge with anyone who's interested enough to listen. Honestly, there was way more information than I could possibly take in, as I was simply in awe of the place. Because I got there for opening time, there was hardly anyone else there, meaning I was lucky enough to roam around the ground floor and the first floor at my own leisure, completely on my own, before having a private tour around the upper parts of the hall. So I started in the Great Hall, which is the first room you walk into when you enter the building through the main doors. Straight in front of you is an archway leading through into another room and some beautiful paintings. But then off to the left is a huge portrait of the main man himself, the man who had Aston Hall built, Sir Thomas Holte. But we'll hear much, much more about him later. So this portrait was actually built years after Thomas's death. We know this because when you look at Aston Hall in the background, that's not how it would have looked when he died in 1654. The hall went through many renovations over the years, so it wouldn't have looked like this until some years later. On the right side of the Great Hall is a fireplace which sits just below a fairly ominous poem on a concrete placard which reads, "If service be thy mean to thrive, thou must therein remain. Both silent, faithful, just and true, content to take some pain. If love of virtue may allure, or hope of worldly gain, if fear of God may thee procure, to serve, do not disdain." So basically, if you serve me loyally, I'll treat you well. But if you betray me, God help you. And that's exactly the feeling I got from exploring the place. Just off to the left of the Great Hall is a hallway with the Great Stairs, a large oak staircase which still bears the scars of the Civil War. As you pass the Great Stairs, you come to a huge room known as the Great Parlour. This room is floor to ceiling with dark brown oak, a common theme throughout the building. There are more portraits and a huge table and chairs, which I can only presume would have been used for entertaining guests on formal occasions. From the Great Parlour, you head into a purple room where you'll find more portraits and some cool artefacts. Then we head back out and take a slow walk up the Great Stairs. The atmosphere as you climb the stairs is noticeably eerie, like you can really imagine someone waiting for you at the top of the stairs. It's also at this point that you notice just how creaky this place is. Honestly, you can't take a step anywhere in Aston Hall without the floorboards creaking underfoot. When you reach the top of the stairs, you come to the great dining room. Notice that all the rooms are called Great Somethings: the Great Hall, the Great Stairs, the Great Parlour, and now the Great Dining Room. This is an impressive open room with a huge dining table fit for a king, and that is exactly what it was. On 18th of October 1642, King Charles I stayed the night at Aston Hall and dined in this very room. This was just 5 days before the first major battle of the Civil War at nearby Edge Hill in Warwickshire. Although, this wasn't the first time the King and Thomas Holte had been in contact. In the 1620s, Thomas's oldest son Edward was appointed one of the grooms of the King's bedchamber. Basically, this meant that Edward was one of the King's closest servants, and Thomas hoped that he could use this position as a strategic advantage, but we'll come on to that later. From here, we come to the withdrawing room. This is the room where the family and their guests would withdraw after dinner and spend some time together. Activities in this room may have included playing music, playing games, and smoking tobacco. Next, we come to, in my opinion, the most impressive room in all of Aston Hall, the Long Gallery. Now, you only had a long gallery if you were extremely wealthy and really wanted to show off. This room was essentially created as an exercise area for the servants when the weather wouldn't permit exercise outdoors. I'd seen pictures and videos of the Long Gallery when conducting my own research, but as you turn right into the gallery and see it firsthand, you really can't help but appreciate how magnificent it is. It's very long, very dark, and very spooky. There are portraits on the wall, and you just can't help but feel that those eyes are watching you, following your every move. From here, I went towards the servants' quarters where I met up with a member of staff. I feel awful for not asking his name, but honestly, he was amazing. He really went above and beyond, taking me all around the upper floors, including some of the rooms that were off limits to the public. So the servants' quarters seem to be the area of Aston Hall where most of the paranormal activity has been reported, which makes sense as this was the most lived-in area of the entire building. It's reported that there were around 35 servants in the hall during Thomas Holte's time here, 15 in the upper quarters and 20 in the lower quarters, although these numbers would have declined through the years. So we stood chatting in the hallway at the top of the stairs, where he told me about the history of this area of the building and about the different rooms that were up here, including Dick's garret, arguably the most haunted room in the building, and the servants' corridor, another paranormal hotspot. He had some insanely spooky stories to tell me which happened in this area. You won't want to miss those, so make sure you hang around. Excuse the pun. He took me through some of the rooms that the public don't get to see, so I really felt quite privileged. He explained the difference between the ways that the servants were treated. The servants on the upper quarters were treated much better than those on the lower quarters. Bigger rooms, more windows, more natural light, etc. The servants' rooms on the lower quarters were generally quite small, dark and dingy, honestly quite depressing. We then headed back downstairs to the Great Hall where my tour came to an end. Now let's have a brief look into the history of Aston Hall, specifically about Thomas Holte and his time there. Then we'll finish off talking about the hauntings, the famous hauntings, and some of the stories told to me by my personal tour guide. But before we go into the history of Aston Hall, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really is the only way for this channel to get recognised by the YouTube algorithm gods. Plus, if you don't subscribe, then tonight, while you're asleep, the ghost of Dick, the servant boy, will swap your apple juice with malt vinegar, and nobody wants a glass of malt vinegar in the morning. And if you think I'm joking, I'm not. It really will happen. So, the Holte family were one of Warwickshire's big-name families back in the 16th and 17th centuries. They weren't just rich, they were seriously influential, were involved in loads of local administration, and had owned land since the 14th century. It all started with a guy named Simon Holte back in 1331. He made his money in the wool trade, and bought the manor of Nechalls. Fast forward a bit, and by the early 1500s, a guy named John Holte had snapped up the manors of Duddeston and Aston. Then Thomas Holte, grandfather of Sir Thomas, added even more land to the collection. But the Holte who really made waves was Sir Thomas Holte, born in 1571. He was the eldest son of Edward Holte and Dorothy Ferrers. Super ambitious, he studied at Magdalen College in Oxford, bought more land, and by the late 1590s he had a serious income of about £2,000 a year, which made him one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. This also earned him the job of High Sheriff, which back then meant you were in charge of keeping law and order. He received a knighthood in 1603 from King James I, as the king made his way from Scotland to London to claim his throne. In 1612, Sir Thomas was able to buy the title of baronet, the first of the Holte baronets. James I sold these new titles in order to raise money to quell trouble in Ireland. Sir Thomas now felt that the Holtes outranked all the local families, and felt a home with more grandeur should be built to reflect both his wealth and status. So, in 1618, Sir Thomas decided to flex his financial muscle by building Aston Hall. He picked a spot on a hill so everyone for miles around would know just how important he was. The hall took 17 years to build, seriously 17 years, and it's now one of the best surviving examples of Jacobean architecture in England. He married Grace Bradbourne and they had 15 children together, yep, 15. But sadly, she died before Aston Hall was finished in 1635. Later, Sir Thomas married Anne Littleton, who was nearly 40 years younger than him, by the way. I wonder what could possibly have been in this marriage for her. Now, despite all of his success, Sir Thomas wasn't exactly the easiest person to live with. He had a long, messy falling out with his eldest son, Edward. We're talking nearly 20 years of drama. As mentioned earlier, Edward had landed a role as one of King Charles I's personal servants. Thomas had hoped that Edward would use this position as a strategic advantage to elevate the Holte family name. So, when Edward fell in love with a woman named Elizabeth King, who didn't come with money or status, Sir Thomas became enraged. He disinherited Edward and flat out refused to accept the marriage. This turned into such a big deal that King Charles I himself got involved in 1627, writing to Sir Thomas, basically asking him to reconsider his stance on the marriage and his son's inheritance. As a result, Sir Thomas made a marriage settlement, but still refused to let Edward inherit the family estate. Tragically, Edward died before his dad, so he never got to inherit anything anyway. Later on, Sir Charles Holte, the third baronet, worked hard to fix the family's finances, and things did improve for the Holtes for a while. The house remained in the Holte family until 1817, when it was sold and leased by James Watt Jr., son of industrial pioneer James Watt. The house was purchased in 1858 by a private company, the Aston Hall and Park Company Limited, for use as a public park and museum. After the company ran into financial difficulties, the house was bought by Birmingham Corporation in 1864, becoming the first historic country house to pass into municipal ownership. And that's the story of how one family's fortune rose and fell alongside one of the most turbulent periods in English history, and how Aston Hall still stands with cannibal scars and ghost stories to prove it. Speaking of ghosts, I think it's about time we talked about some of the ghost stories to come from Aston Hall. So there are 3 well-known ghosts that haunt these halls, and one fairly dubious one, so let's start there. The story goes that before Aston Hall was built, Sir Thomas Holte lived at nearby Duddeston Hall. Legend has it that the only person who received a tender word from Sir Thomas was his cook, John, for he had found the only way to reach his master's heart was via his esophagus, and ably applied his art. Then, one day, Sir Thomas was out hunting deer, when one of his companions, Richard Smallbroke, wagered his swiftest horse that if they rode back unexpectedly to Holte's home, they would find his cook unprepared. Sir Thomas accepted the bet with absolute confidence, declaring I'd sooner doubt the sun to keep accustomed time than doubt my good cook John. Unfortunately for Sir Thomas and his good cook John, Richard Smallbroke was absolutely right. Enraged because he had lost the wager and had been somewhat embarrassed, Sir Thomas allegedly seized a cleaver keen and cold and cleft the skull of his cook in twain. Sir Thomas was accused of murder in 1606 by William Ascrick of Birmingham, who claimed that Sir Thomas took a cleaver and hit his cook with the same cleaver, and clave his head that the one side fell thereof upon one of his shoulders, and the other side on the other shoulder. Wealthy Sir Thomas sued him for slander and was awarded damages, although the verdict was overturned after an appeal. Ascrick was cleared and would not have to pay, although Sir Thomas was never charged for his wicked deed. The logic behind this was that whilst the halves of the cook's head had indeed fallen onto either shoulder, there was no evidence that the man had been deliberately killed. I mean, of course a man's head can fall into two pieces of its own accord. Obviously. Sir Thomas's wealth and status meant that he was above the law. Rumours naturally arose, and local tradition told later of how Sir Thomas murdered his cook in a cellar at Duddeston by running him through with a spit, and was subsequently compelled as punishment to adopt the red hand on his coat of arms. Now, it's been reported that the cook's ghost has been sighted around the kitchen areas of Aston Hall. However, the cook was never actually at Aston Hall. So did the ghost of the cook follow Sir Thomas to the hall to haunt him for the rest of his days, or is this just an exaggerated myth? Personally, I'm not buying it, but let me know what you think in the comments section. Now, the other three spirits that are said to haunt the hall are far more intriguing. The Green Lady is said to be the ghostly apparition of Mistress Walker. This spectral figure is often described as a middle-aged woman dressed in an unmistakable green gown, complete with a high collar befitting the fashion of her time. Her ghost seems particularly drawn to periods of renovation, perhaps disturbed by the constant changes to her beloved home, and her presence is often accompanied by the sweet scent of roses. The long gallery and the stairs leading up to the servants' quarters are said to be her favourite haunts. This leads me to the first story told to me by that member of staff today. So, last year, an elderly woman of 90-something years old visited the hall for the first time since the 1960s. He told me that when the old lady spoke to him, she insisted that she'd seen a ghost here the last time she visited the hall. Intrigued, but not wanting to feed the woman any information on the ghosts of the hall, he asked her to describe exactly what she'd seen. She told him that she was walking up the stairs towards Dick's garret. She noticed out of the corner of her eye a woman in a long emerald dress. She turned to face the woman as she continued up the stairs. The woman in green smiled and curtsied at her. Glancing away for just a second to focus on the stairs in front of her, she took her eyes off the lady in green. But when she looked back just a few seconds later, the Green Lady had completely disappeared. A former security guard also had a very spooky encounter on the stairs leading up to the servants' quarters. He said he had his hand on the banister as he turned the corner, when all of a sudden, his hand went ice cold. When he looked down at his hand out of sheer curiosity, he saw the ghostly hand of a woman resting on top of his own hand. With that, he turned and fled. Yeah, fuck that. I would have been out of there quicker than you can say, Green Lady, and not a chance would I have ever gone back in there. He continued to tell me that a former guide reported spotting a woman in a green dress standing by a window. When he followed her into the next room, she had simply disappeared. Another staff member, approaching closing time, saw the spectral figure sitting calmly in a chair at the end of the long gallery, only for her to fade from view as he approached. Another ghost said to haunt the hall is the tragic ghost of a boy named Dick. Now this is one ghost that I would most certainly not want to see, not because he's evil or anything like that, in fact quite the opposite. The ghost of Dick is said to be seen hanging from the rafters of an area of Aston Hall known as Dick's Garret. So legend has it that one day a hungry young servant boy named Dick stole a small piece of bread and was caught by another member of staff. What a grass. And was subsequently locked in the attic until Sir Thomas arrived home to decide on the boy's punishment. Now picture this. You're a little boy, probably 11 to 12 years old. You're starving, so you pinch a small piece of bread, hardly the crime of the century. So you've been caught and locked in the attic to await your punishment. You know the master of the house has a violent temper. You've heard the rumours that he split the former cook's head in two with a meat cleaver. Obviously, you're going to be absolutely petrified. Living in fear day after day, poor Dick anticipated the arrival of Sir Thomas and his impending punishment. But Sir Thomas never came, and Dick could no longer live in fear. So he took matters into his own hands and hung himself from the rafters. Dick's ghost is now said to haunt the attic, and his ghostly apparition has been reported numerous times, either hanging from the rafters or nervously pacing backwards and forwards along the attic, probably still awaiting his punishment. On one occasion, a group of 5 visitors were exploring Dick's garret, when all of a sudden, all 5 of them ran back down the stairs, screaming. When asked what was wrong, they all reported seeing the dead body of a young boy lying beneath the bed in Dick's garret. The third and probably most reported spirit seen in Aston Hall is that of the Grey Lady, believed to be the spirit of Mary Holte, daughter of Sir Thomas. So Mary had fallen in love, and asked for her father's permission to marry. However, the man that Mary wanted to marry was a man of low social standing, and so Sir Thomas forbade the marriage. In a desperate attempt to defy her father, Mary planned to elope with her love. Unfortunately, her plans were thwarted and she was to be severely punished. Thomas locked his daughter in a room in Aston Hall, allegedly for 16 years. Now, I've heard 2 stories relating to the death of poor Mary. The first goes that she eventually died of a broken heart after being locked in the room for so long. Although it's more probable that she died of malnutrition, but who am I to argue? The second story is that Mary attempted to escape the hall via one of the windows, but as she was climbing out of the window, she slipped and fell, breaking her back, which eventually killed her. Whichever version of the story you believe to be true, one thing remains consistent, and that is that the ghost of the Grey Lady has been reported wandering the rooms of Aston Hall by numerous guests over the years. So, when that staff member was talking to me about the ghosts of the hall, I just had to ask him if he had ever experienced anything paranormal in the hall, to which he responded, to be honest, personally, I've never really believed in that sort of stuff. Although he did admit that walking around locking up at night certainly has him on edge. However, he did go on to say that there was one incident that made him change his mind about whether or not he really believed that Aston Hall was haunted. Now, my memory is awful, so I can't remember exactly where in the hall this incident occurred, but he said he was locking up when he distinctively heard at least 2 sets of footsteps walking overhead. He did say that this particular area is always locked up and not open to the public, so he thought it was very strange for anyone to be up there, but presumed his colleague must have wandered up there for some reason. So he got on the radio and asked the only other member of staff who was present at the time if they were upstairs, to which he received a response that sent a chill down his spine. "No, I'm down in the Great Hall. Why?" As I think I mentioned earlier, you can't walk anywhere in Aston Hall without the floor creaking underfoot. So I said to him, "Are you certain it wasn't just the sounds of the floorboards creaking for some reason?" And he said, "No, absolutely not. This was not creaking. This was footsteps, clearly at least 2 sets of footsteps." And this man is often on those upper floors of Aston Hall on his own. Kudos to him. You would not get me up there on my own after dark. No, thank you. He then told me another story which I find absolutely terrifying. So every now and then, Aston Hall have to call in an environmental conservation engineer. This guy came in to do his reports, checking for leaks and any sign of wear and tear caused by the environment, that sort of stuff. The weather on this particular day was awful, like thunderstorm sort of weather. So perfect for... The weather on this particular day was awful, like thunderstorm sort of weather. So perfect for identifying leaks, but also perfect for a good old-fashioned ghost story. So the engineer worked his way up to the servants' quarters, right by Dick's garret. He was carrying out some checks on the landing when the door to Dick's garret flung open of its own accord. Nothing to worry about, the wind's howling outside, probably a strong breeze blew the door open. Surely. So, the man went up to investigate. As he climbed the stairs, he instantly noticed that there was no breeze. Okay, at that point, I'm ending my report there. I'm turning around and I'm hightailing it right out of that building. But the engineer didn't do that. Instead, he carried on walking up the stairs towards the door, when all of a sudden, the door slammed shut again, then opened, then slammed again. So yes, at this point the man did then run straight out of there without finishing his report. Other than these stories, there have been reports of knocks and scratching sounds coming from the other side of locked doors, the sound of keys jangling, more reports of footsteps in otherwise empty spaces, disembodied voices, and the sound of crying on the upper floors, and of course the feeling of being watched. In conclusion, I absolutely do believe that Aston Hall is haunted by more than one spirit. Given my own personal experiences, it would be incredibly ignorant of me to dismiss the possibility that somewhere with a history like that of Aston Hall could be haunted. But what do you think? Have you ever visited Aston Hall? Did you get the feeling that you weren't alone? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments section. I hope you've enjoyed my investigation of Aston Hall. Don't forget to like and subscribe, click here for more ghostly content, and I'll see you on the next one. I'm your host, Severed Soul.